Last week we finished talking about Hellenistic Greece, and we were looking at the series of successions that led to the individual named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We were looking in, we've been using Daniel chapter 11 as kind of a resource to kind of look at the prophecies relating to some of these events. And so we started off, or we finished off with in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about in his place, this is one of the previous kings of the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid Greek Empire. In his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. The jewel of his kingdom, that's a reference to Judea or to Jerusalem particularly. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. This is a reference to Seleucus IV Philopator. We talked about this last week. And his Heliodorus, which was basically his director of finance, who was sent not just to Judea but other places as well to collect taxes and tribute and revenue, and brought that back to him. And so the oppressor that they're talking about is the tax collector. The Jews did not have a lot of fondness for foreign tax collectors, as we see particularly in the first century with the Roman tax collectors. Ultimately, though, Seleucus IV he dies, or possibly is assassinated. The facts are not entirely clear. He is theoretically succeeded by his son Antiochus, who is a young man, or actually a boy, at the time that he succeeds him, and so he doesn't really do very well. Daniel continues and says, in his place, that is to say, in the place of Seleucus IV, a despicable person will arise on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And we're talking here, as I said at the beginning, about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV is Seleucus IV's brother, so technically he is not the actual proper heir to the throne. Antiochus, who never even got a number because he didn't last very long, Antiochus is technically the heir to the throne, but Antiochus comes and he comes in and basically pretends to be the guardian or the regent for Antiochus, but essentially kind of takes over the power from him and then gets rid of it. And so he becomes the king of the Seleucid Greek Empire. Antiochus IV Epiphanes is each of these guys, the names that they have, in some cases, so for example, Antiochus IV was just named Antiochus when he was a kid, and it wasn't until he assumed the throne that he gave himself his reigning name, which is the Epiphanes part. This kind of goes to something you had asked earlier in the series, Jerry. These guys were not named, they didn't have these crazy names when they were born. Generally, they just had a singular name, and then when they took over the throne or they ascended to power, or in some cases they did something great or impressive, the name was conferred on them. But in the case of the kings, they actually chose their name, and so Seleucus IV chose Philopator. Philo has to do with love. I don't know what the other part of it is, but so they chose names that are significant in them, names that tell you something about the character and ideology that they are espousing. And that's significant when you think about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, because Epiphanes means God manifest. So he took a name that basically says, I am the living God. So that's a problem, as you can imagine, when it comes to how he's going to be interacting with the Jews. So Antiochus IV ascends to the throne, and then Daniel goes on to say that after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. This is still talking about the process by which he usurped the throne from Antiochus, the proper heir, and took over. In time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. And Antiochus Epiphanes is successful in a number of respects. He's successful in conquering and controlling more of the Seleucid Empire more completely than anybody before him did. He's able to control Babylonia and Persia, the eastern parts of the empire, and ultimately he's able to have a great deal of success even against Egypt, against the Ptolemies down in that part of the Ptolemaic Greek Empire. And so he actually has a lot of success. And then it goes on and says he will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. So he goes down towards the south. The southern armies, the armies of the Ptolemies, go up against him. The Ptolemy in this particular case is Ptolemy the VI Philopator. He is a relatively young ruler when he takes over. Antiochus believes that gives him an opportunity to succeed, and indeed Ptolemy does gather together a huge army, but as Daniel says, he will not stand. That's talking about Ptolemy. For schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil. They will speak lies to each other at the same table. What actually happened here was that while Ptolemy went out to fight against Antiochus, two of his generals, Comanus and Cineas, conspired against him to basically rebel and take over the kingdom, or to try to do that, which forced Ptolemy to basically divide his forces and ultimately have to go back to deal with what was going on in his capital. That lost him the war against Antiochus, and effectively he became well, initially he was captured by Antiochus, and Antiochus then basically made him a puppet king ruling over Egypt on the Antiochus' behalf. Antiochus didn't want to completely try to take over Egypt because he knew that Rome did not want the Syrian Greek Empire, the Seleucids, to take over the Egyptian Greek Empire, because Egypt was the source of grain for the Roman Empire. So the Romans had a problem with that arrangement, so rather than run the risk of trying to conquer it outright, he basically conquered it and then turned it back over to the guy who was the rightful king, but that guy's job was to work for him. So when it talks about them sitting at the same table lying to each other, it's talking about this idea that basically they have this alliance, but both of them is prepared to betray the other one. Antiochus has no more use for the Ptolemy than him doing what he tells him to, and the Ptolemy is basically waiting for Antiochus to leave so that he can do whatever he wants to do. And so, sure enough, then it says it will not succeed. This is the lying back and forth. Ultimately, the alliance falls apart because the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. Anybody want to guess who the Holy Covenant is? Oh, come on. This isn't very hard.
Well, is he talking about God here?
I'm not talking about God, but who is he talking about? The Jews. He's talking about the Jews.
Okay.
So he says he will return to his land with much plunder. So he takes all the stuff that all of the plunder that he got from Egypt, and he heads home with it. But he says his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action and then return to his own land. And what that is talking about is that Antiochus, when he leaves Egypt, he goes up and stops off in Jerusalem and basically puts a garrison there, takes control of the city, and begins to order the Jews to convert to a Hellenistic way of thinking and away from Judaism. Now, he doesn't start to really enforce it yet, but he has basically made it clear that he is taking control. And he also, it appears, was given a tour of the temple by the high priest at the time, which would have been a violation of Jewish law as well. We'll talk about that in a second here. So now what we're talking about, this particular lesson is the Hasmoneans. The Hasmonean dynasty is actually the short period of time in the late 2nd century BC, so the middle 2nd century BC, where the Jewish people actually regain control over their own homeland for a period of time. And the Hasmoneans are the dynasty, the family that actually leads them during this time. So during this period of time, we've been talking a lot about all the different things that are happening in different parts of the world, but one of the things that's been going on in Jerusalem is you've had a succession of high priests there. The high priest early on in Antiochus' reign, and actually going back quite a ways into some of the earlier ones, Simon II was the high priest who reigned from 219 to 199. Yes, sir.
So did all these high priests, were they able to trace their lineage back to Aaron?
Yes. These, well, I'll tell you when they are. so yes, the majority of the high priests we're going to be talking about can actually trace their lineage to Aaron. There's a couple of exceptions, but for the most part they can. Yes.
So it wasn't until the Romans started appointing them that really got sidetracked.
Well, yeah, because at the time, even though even though the Ptolemies and then later the Seleucids were kind of appointing them, they still seem to have been choosing from actual legitimate descendants of Aaron. So it was kind of like I don't know, you could think of like they got a candidate pool, you know, there's like 4 or 5 guys and like, well, we like that one, you know, or whatever. In fact, I'll tell you in a second one of the major criteria for how they chose them. So Simon was the high priest early, prior to a lot of this stuff, but Simon did some things, including building up the temple somewhat and fortifying the walls of Jerusalem beyond the point that they'd been fortified previously, which made it more of a fortress than it had been in a long time, probably going back to Nebuchadnezzar destroying it. So Simon II is responsible for a lot of that. And remember what we said a few weeks ago. By this time, the leadership of Israel is pretty much under the control of the high priests. There's no king. There is a governor or somebody from the Seleucids or previously from the Ptolemies is there to make sure that taxes get paid and that sort of stuff goes on. There's no rebellions or whatever. But for the most part, the local government is controlled by the high priests, and so they're the ones that are doing these things. So Simon reinforces the walls of Jerusalem, creates a cistern inside of Jerusalem. Why is that important?
Siege.
Okay. Siege, but what about a siege? What does it give you during a siege? Gives you water. Okay, so it's really important to have access to water during a siege. So basically, he does some things that improve the fortifications of Jerusalem. And oddly enough, the Seleucid governor has no problem with this because from his standpoint, they're just fortifying one of the Seleucid cities. So why is it a bad thing? You know, because apparently they don't have enough experience with the Jews yet to know it's a bad thing.
Now, since obviously you've not been here for every class, you may want to cover this. Have the Pharisees risen to power at all by this?
The Pharisees don't even exist yet. The Sadducees have become to be significant at this point because they're associated with the high priests and with the restoration of the Levitical worship services and stuff like that.
So it's very, very near the end of this intertestamental period of the Pharisees came.
That's correct, yes. It will happen during the Hasmonean dynasty, actually. That's where we're going to see that come out. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees rather, at this point, are leaning towards Hellenism, towards the Greek influences and stuff like that. They're favoring that as a general rule because that's where the power comes from right now. It comes from Greece down to the high priests and the temple party, and so the Sadducees are sort of plugged into that. So Simon II is the high priest that fortifies Jerusalem. His son, Onias III, is the high priest when Antiochus actually assumes the throne. Onias is the high priest for, they're not exactly sure when it started, but 199 is a pretty good bet. 175 is when he stops being the high priest, and he's succeeded by his brother Jason. Now, can anybody see anything unusual or significant about the difference between those two names? Anything jump out at you?
Greek.
One is more Greek than
Jason.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is correct. And so as it happens, Jason's name was probably not Jason when it started. But Jason changed his name to become more Greek and to become more Hellenistic, in part at least probably to curry favor with the Seleucids and their king.
Was he a Sadducee as well?
He was, whether he was a Sadducee or not, I don't know, he was high priest, so he would have been, the Sadducees were more about being attached to the high priesthood than they were being the high priesthood. So Jason succeeds Onias, and there's a lot of evidence at this point to suggest that, number one, the Hellenistic leanings of the high priest were a significant factor in who got appointed. Onias didn't die. He basically was forced to resign by Antiochus IV, and Jason took over for him. So it's not entirely clear, but the speculation that based on some of the recorded writings and some of that stuff is that there's a mixture of Hellenistic favoritism going on here, and also which high priest could come up with the biggest bribe. Not exactly bribe, could basically promise to exact the largest amount of tribute from the Judeans to send to whoever was in charge, Antiochus in this particular case, Epiphanes. So Jason apparently promised a higher amount, plus he was more Hellenistic in his outlook, and so Onias had to resign and Jason took over as the high priest. So Jason takes over as the high priest, but after about 3 or 4 years, he is not sufficiently Hellenistic, and so he ends up getting replaced by a guy named Menelaus, and that's a really Greek name, by the way, in case you don't know it. He gets replaced by a guy named Menelaus, who is like super Hellenistic. In fact, Menelaus is really more interested in doing Greek stuff than he is in actually doing high priesthood for God Almighty. So we've kind of veered away from that whole, monotheism and real dedicated mindset that we had not too long ago here. Menelaus takes over. Actually, I like how he did this. So Menelaus is not part of the family that Jason came from. The sources are unclear, going to come to the question you asked earlier. The sources are unclear as to whether he was even a descendant of Aaron, or whether he might have simply been a Levite who was working for the priesthood. Jerry?
The Hellenistic influence that's taking place in Jerusalem and in Judea, does that include the gods that the Greeks had?
It does now. It didn't before, not so much anyway. Most of the Hellenistic influence previously was culture, language, some of those kinds of things. But now the Greek god stuff is starting to get in there, because once Antiochus Epiphanes takes over, he starts enforcing strict Hellenism throughout his empire. And that's one of the things, when he stopped off in Jerusalem in 170, that's one of the things that he was basically there to do, was to reinforce this notion that strict Hellenism, including the worship of Greek gods, was a part of the expected behavior of all of the citizens of the Seleucid Empire. Yes, sir. I don't know your name, I don't think.
Mike.
Mike, nice to meet you, Mike.
And you are?
I'm Ryan.
Hello, Ryan.
Nice to meet you.
So why was he interested in enforcing strict Hellenism? Was it an ideologue, or was this an economic or power play?
It's really hard to distinguish those things when it comes to the Greeks and the Romans, because their ideology and power was all mixed in together just inherently. Power was part of the ideology of the Greek and the Roman empires. But in Antiochus's case, it appears to be tied into his own god complex to a significant extent. He thinks of himself as the manifestation of the gods, and therefore he considers it his mission to make sure that the gods are being properly worshipped throughout the empire. So he's like sort of a fanatical missionary coupled with a king and all this other stuff. So,
But it sounds like he stopped short of deifying himself like the later Roman emperors.
that is correct. He did not. He was not asking to be worshipped himself. It was more like he thought of himself as the avatar of the gods, or of God, Zeus or whatever, rather than thinking he was God. So he was not calling for emperor worship or for king worship. He was simply focused on getting people to worship the Greek gods and to integrate Greek god worship into their way of doing things. So when Menelaus takes over, he's willing to go along with this, and he actually supports this approach to things. Sorry, I got a little distracted there, because what happens is that Menelaus is basically working for him, and Jason gives him the annual tribute to take to Antiochus, which he takes to Antiochus and bribes him with it to make him the high priest. So, not the smoothest move ever on Jason's part, but that's how he loses his job. So, Menelaus becomes the high priest. Onias begins to publicly accuse Menelaus because what Menelaus does is he basically goes in the temple and just starts taking everything of value out of him to start giving it to Antiochus to basically maintain his position with him. And Onias accuses Menelaus of doing this, and basically just won't stop bugging him, kind of like John the Baptist with Herod and his wife. And ultimately Menelaus arranges to have the Seleucid governor make plans to have, and he has Onias killed to get him out of the way, to get him to shut up and stop being a problem, and to basically consolidate Menelaus's power. So, okay, so now we've got a situation where there's a growing degree of pressure on the Jews to conform to Hellenism in terms of not just the culture, not just philosophy, not just language, but also in terms of how they worship and how they behave. And it's going to get worse, because Daniel says this: at the appointed time he will return. This is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened, and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly towards the covenant. So, when we talk about what Antiochus IV Epiphanes did, Antiochus goes back. So what happens is that, I said earlier that he had this arrangement with the Ptolemy, that the Ptolemy was going to do what he told him to. Well, as soon as he left and his army left, the Ptolemy basically said, I'm not going to do that anymore, I'm going to go back to what I was doing. So a couple of years later, in 168, Antiochus heads back down to Egypt to invade again, to reassert his control. And this time it appears that his plan is basically, I'm not going to leave a Ptolemy in charge, I'm going to take over the whole thing and it's going to be mine. And he goes in and he is successful in capturing pretty much all of Egypt except for Alexandria, which is the capital city, but he captures all of eastern Egypt, a lot of the central parts, and there's not a lot in the west that's really all that important, but he captures all of that, and he's marching on Alexandria when the ships of Kittim arrive, which is a Roman fleet that shows up. Now they don't show up where he's at, but they arrive at Alexandria, and a guy named Gaius Popilius Laetus, which is just a great name for your kids or something like that if you're looking for one. Gaius Popilius Laetus, who's a proconsul of the Roman emperor, or the Roman government. At this point they're not an empire, the Roman Senate. He goes out, basically, and the accounts are a little bit conflicting. The one I like the best is that he just shows up by himself, and he's probably about 60 years old, he's got a cane, and he's just standing there when Antiochus Epiphanes shows up with his army. That's probably not really very likely. The more likely accounts are that he shows up with a small number of, basically a retinue and a small force of Roman legionnaires, but nevertheless, it's a tiny little force compared to the army that Antiochus has coming with it. But Antiochus is informed that there is a delegation from Rome that's there, and Antiochus goes out to meet him, and he goes up to Gaius and extends his hand to shake his hand, and instead Gaius puts a scroll into his hand that basically is a decision or a judgment by the Roman Senate. And he says, you need to read this. And so Antiochus opens it up, and it's a judgment from the Roman Senate that has determined basically that that Antiochus' invasion of Egypt is interfering with the Egyptian grain being shipped properly to Rome, and so therefore Rome can no longer tolerate this invasion. And so basically it says, stop where you are, turn around and go back, and vacate Egypt within like 3 months, basically. Everything has to be out of Egypt in 3 months. And so that is his message there. So Gaius says to him, I need an answer from you. Will you abide by what the Senate has said? And so Antiochus tries to play for time. He says, well, give me a little while. I need to confer with my generals and my staff and get their input. And Gaius takes his cane and draws a circle in the dirt around Antiochus and says, if you leave that circle without giving me an answer, you will be an enemy of the Roman Empire.
Oh my.
And so Antiochus is just stunned and basically says, okay, I'll do what the Senate asks. And after that, then Guy shakes his hand, he's all friendly and everything, but it's, this is a man who knows how to use power, is my point. And the thing, we haven't talked about Rome yet. We won't talk about Rome until we're done with the Hasmoneans for the most part. But the thing you need to understand about Rome, just in brief, is Rome has gradually been getting stronger and stronger. And at this point, Rome has already conquered the two northern Greek empires, the Macedonian Empire and the empire that was in Asia Minor. It's already conquered both of those two empires. And it's pretty obvious to anyone who's paying attention that Rome is now a force that is probably equal to all of Greece, including, despite how massive the Seleucid Empire is, that the Romans are very much equal to or greater than what Greece can muster up against them. And particularly since Rome in this case has decided to ally itself with Egyptian Greece, there's no way that Antiochus can stand against those two forces together. So Antiochus does the smart thing and he goes home. Now, the accounts are a little bit conflicted. A lot of the accounts suggest that he was enraged, that he was basically just furious when he went. Other accounts suggest that ultimately he might have been happy about the outcome, not so much because he got humiliated in public and stuff, but because it gave him an excuse to go home without having to fight a protracted battle to capture Alexandria that might have cost him a lot of troops and a lot of effort. So regardless, though, of whether he might have ultimately liked the result, there's no way he was happy about how it happened and how humiliating it was to have that happen to him. So, as you might imagine, he's looking for somebody to take his anger out on. And essentially, Jerusalem becomes the target. It's kind of like, the guy who gets beat up by somebody else and goes home and kicks his dog, That's kind of the thing. So he heads back from this whole disaster. And as Daniel says about it, he says that he's going to be disheartened and return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he's headed back towards home, but on the way he stops off in Jerusalem. So when he comes back and he gets back to Jerusalem, he goes through and he goes into the sanctuary fortress, that would be the temple, and he basically desecrates the temple. He sets up a Greek altar, an altar to the Greek god Zeus Olympus, which is actually it's called a syncretic, he sets up the abomination of desolation. That's what Daniel's referring to. It's a syncretic cult. It's a cult that incorporates elements of Greek worship as well as elements of Jewish mysticism together into one sort of weird amalgamation that's designed to be attractive to Jews because it has elements of Jewish thought in there. So he sets up an altar to Zeus Olympus. He enforces and then leaves behind a garrison to enforce the requirements that the Jews can no longer hold their Sabbaths, can no longer carry out their worship to Jehovah God. They're required to eat pork. They're required to do all sorts of things that are just, they're no longer allowed to circumcise. It's basically everything that makes Jewish cultural identity significant is being removed. Everything that's under the law that's required for Jews to do, you can't do it anymore. And he enforces all of this stuff with his soldiers and with his governor that he leaves behind. Jerry?
What does syncretic mean?
Syncretic is basically the idea of a combination where you're kind of pulling from multiple different approaches.
Things synchronized.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good word. You come across this with the New Age movement, for example. The New Age movement yanks from Buddhism and Eastern mysticism and Hinduism and reincarnation. It pulls from all these different things to create this sort of amalgamation that sounds really good because it's got all these different things in it that people like, so.
At the risk of jumping ahead of where you're going, with them enforcing all of this stuff that basically gutted the Jewish covenantal relationship with God,
right.
Is there a remnant that either flees Jerusalem or lives in the countryside surrounded in Judea?
I think you just introduced his next point.
Yeah. Just wait, we're going to get there.
Okay.
There's a reason this is called the Hasmonean dynasty and not the Antiochus IV Epiphanes dynasty.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, give me a second. So
I think he owes you lunch now.
so here's the next sentence in Daniel. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So what would you guess the answer would be to your question? So those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Now, the hypocrisy thing means people are going to join with them that aren't serious about it, but some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Okay. Trying to decide what order to do this in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book of Daniel. We talked previously about some of the scholarly issues that are raised about the book of Daniel in terms of the extreme detail of these predictions that are being made here compared to anything else in the scriptures, and even anything else in the book of Daniel for that matter. And we've talked about some of the oddities of Daniel, including the fact that it didn't exist as part of the Jewish canon until about 150 to 100 BC, which was well after the Jewish canon was pretty formally established in the 500 to 400 BC range. One of the things that's troubling to some people about the book of Daniel is, if you were to go, in fact, Jerry, go ahead and open up your Bible for me to Daniel chapter 11, verse 35.
Daniel?
Oh, you've got it right back there. Okay, so read for me verse 35.
Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end.
Okay.
For it will still come at the appointed time.
Okay, so that's you have a different translation than I do, but that's exactly what this is. That's the last sentence that I've got up here.
NIV.
Now go ahead and read verses 36 and 37, just those two.
The king will do as he pleases. He'll exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods, the capital G God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. Verse 37, he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all.
Okay, so based on what we've just been talking about and looking at, who would you say the king that's being referred to in the passage I just had him read is?
The Hellenistic
Antiochus IV Epiphanes?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that, and you haven't been here before, so you don't know this, one of the things that we see in Daniel is that he keeps referring to the king, and actually it keeps shifting through time to be, somebody says the king of the north, it'll be the next guy in line sometimes. So with that in mind, let's say the most rational person, the most rational thing you would think of is he's either talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes or his successor, right? That would seem to be the logical thing to assume from reading that.
Well, it sounds more like one of the Roman emperors.
Okay, so,
Or is that jumping too far?
well, that's the question then. So if you in that situation, you've gone from, up until this point, this prophecy has been fairly linear in terms of here's what's happening. You know, it goes through, and essentially when it comes to things that matter to Jerusalem or to Judea, that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about all the other stuff that's going on in the Greek, the divided Greek Empire and everything else. But the things that matter to the people that live in Jerusalem and Judea, it's been talking about those things right up until this point. So, does it make sense for it to suddenly jump ahead to 200 years later or something like that? Maybe more than that if we're talking about one of the Roman emperors.
That's what the prophecy, they
Okay.
go wherever they want.
So that they can. They can, but what's interesting is that you go from a very specific and very linear prophecy
His trend has
to
been
suddenly jump
generation
ahead.
by generation.
Right. And so what's interesting is your speculation is maybe it's talking about one of the Roman emperors. The general assumption among biblical scholars who are inclined to accept the absolute authority of the Scripture is it's not talking about one of the Roman emperors. It's talking about the Antichrist in the end times. So he hasn't jumped ahead a couple of hundred years. He's jumped ahead 2,000 years while still making it appear that he's talking about the same lineage of kings that he was talking about before. Now,
My second comment was going to be, he's talking about the devil.
okay,
To just supplant God completely.
okay.
But that's a little more problematic to me.
Yeah.
That's for a number of reasons,
Right,
but the difficulty for me at least in reading this passage, and for a lot of scholars who are reading this passage, isn't the notion that prophecy can jump ahead. It's the notion that there doesn't seem to be any clear distinction as far as why this is happening. And it gets really confusing then later on in Daniel chapter 11 and moving into Daniel chapter 12 when he starts citing these numbers, because these numbers refer to the abomination that causes desolation, but then they're interpreted in terms of being some kind of reference to years or some sort of mystery period of time, even though the abomination that causes desolation is supposed to have happened during Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So, and Jesus then later on will make a reference to Daniel's prophecy about the abomination that causes desolation, saying, here's something you're going to watch for. So, the point that I'm making with this is what's interesting is that up until that passage, to the point of Daniel chapter 11, verse 35, the prophecy of Daniel chapter 11 is very, very easily directly relatable to historical events. From 36 on, it suddenly becomes completely unrelatable to clear historical events,
Even verse 40.
which is,
At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. The king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. and he shall come into the countries and shall overflow and pass through.
That's not really what happens. Rome invades them, and they cease to exist before Rome eventually takes over Egypt. So it becomes that, and that's one of the reasons why it's moved forward to the end times prophecy, because it doesn't make sense in the context. But see, they're again still using the same phraseology, and so the argument that a lot of scholars make who are not believers in sola scriptura, the idea of the scriptures being fully inspired and understandable by anybody, is that what really is going on here is that Daniel was not written in the 6th century or 5th or 7th century BC, when the person Daniel would have been a minister to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and then later on to the early kings of Persia. But rather, this is written around this time, around this point in time, because you can see where the logic falls from. Because if I can write something, it sounds kind of vague, but it's still very specific, and I can write something that comes right up to the moment where I'm at, then that starts to sound like a pretty good prophecy. But at whatever point I no longer know what's going to happen next, because it hasn't happened yet, I start to get real vague about things, you know? And so the argument that a lot of scholars have made is that this supports the notion that Daniel was written in the mid-2nd century. And when you couple that with the fact that Daniel doesn't really appear in any of the Jewish canon until about 50 years after that, you start to have kind of this disturbing set of facts that goes on. Jerry?
If you read the King James of it,
yes,
in 36 and 37 both, he's talking about God. Now, I guess there's some concern whether that's a God or it's a lowercase gods. Is there any discussion or any thought that he's talking about some priest that was in the high priest that's involved in here when he's calling him king? It's a high priest that set himself up as king or as acting as king in Judea?
That is what ultimately the Hasmonean dynasty is going to do, is they're going to unify I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's not like it's a secret, you can go look it up online if you wanted to. The Hasmonean dynasty is going to unify the priesthood with the kingship over Judea, but it doesn't really fit because they don't really rebel against God particularly. What happened? I'm going to give you a lot of hints here. The Pharisees arise in large part because of this unification, because they don't believe that the priests and the priesthood and the kingship should be in the hands of the same person. They look and they say David was chosen as king. The king should be of the line of David. Aaron was chosen as high priest. The high priest should be of the line of Aaron, and it should not be unified together. And that's a significant element of their argument and of their reason to exist, in fact.
So calling the high priest king kind of doesn't fit with their philosophy.
It doesn't fit with the Pharisees' philosophy. It doesn't fit with what the scriptures seem to indicate. So you can make an argument that by anointing themselves or by making themselves king, the Hasmoneans were violating some principle of God's law. But the problem is when you're talking about some of these things here, we're talking about magnifying himself above every god, speaking monstrous things against the God of gods, that doesn't really fit any of the Hasmoneans, any of what they did. It comes close to fitting a few of the Roman emperors. Nero, arguably, what's the guy? What's that?
Caligula.
Not so much Caligula, he was just nuts. What's the name of the guy I can't think of the name right now. He was the one who was responsible there were a couple of them. Domitian was probably the worst of them, but Domitian, and there were a couple of others that were like that, that engaged in emperor worship that were really, really bad. It fits some of those, and certainly from the standpoint of what the Church of Christ believes about the Antichrist, which is that the Antichrist is not a specific person at the end times, but rather simply a manifestation of an anti-God or anti-Christ impulse among people throughout history. And at most it might refer to someone like Domitian, for example, then theoretically this could be made to apply to someone like Domitian. In fact, it would probably more than any other Roman emperor would fit with Domitian best of all of them. And it does have some things like, the one who's desired by women. That suggests a Christ figure, a Messiah figure, rather than one of the characters in this story. There's nobody in the Hasmonean dynasty that's really going to fit that description all that well, whereas Jesus is referred to in that way, and his title of Son of Man is kind of tied into that idea as well. So anyway, the point is, the reason I bring this up is I'm not trying to tell you that I think that Daniel is not a canonical book and that it's not inspired. I do believe that it is the most problematic book of any book in the Bible when it comes to some of these questions, some of these issues, and I think that part of my job, and I could be wrong about this, but I feel like part of my duty as a teacher is to let you know where there are, sort of the pitfalls that you might encounter if you're talking to someone, and if you encounter someone who is well educated in the scholarly view of the Bible and it not being inspired. Daniel is one of the first places they're going to go, and these are some of the arguments that they're going to make when you encounter something like that.
Aren't there other books of the Bible that kind of split time where there was some editorial material perhaps added after the fact?
There are a few, yes.
And that could be what's going on here, that Daniel wrote in his time frame and then was later edited.
That's true, but if that happened, then that one's problematic in Daniel's case because Daniel directly attributes these statements to himself.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, you could be right, but if you're right, that creates a different problem, because that's actually then, so somebody added it, pretended to be Daniel and added it. Was he inspired? And if so, does that mean God was inspiring something to write down a lie? And that's probably, so you start to get into some stuff you don't necessarily want to start wandering into, But that's the argument that a lot of scholars would make, is that Daniel is actually a compilation of prophecies and stories that were accumulated over a period of 300 or so years, from the time of the late Babylonian, early Persian Empire, all the way through the point at which the Maccabeans, or the revolt against the Seleucid rule, actually took place. My argument would be that there is a shift here. There is a time shift here. It most likely, as I've already said, it most likely involves jumping ahead to Domitian. And I think one of the things that we have to remember is that just because someone is given a revelation doesn't mean that they necessarily entirely understand the revelation themselves. Okay? Isaiah probably did not have a very clear picture of what the Messiah looked like, even though he wrote more prophecy about it than almost anybody else did. I don't mean what he looked like in the sense of how tall he was and what color his beard was. I mean what the Messiah was going to be about. Isaiah's understanding of him would have been limited to bits and pieces of what he was revealed in the prophecies in order to write them down. But it's kind of like that story about 6 blind men trying to figure out what an elephant looks like, and touching different parts of it, coming with radically different understandings of what an elephant looks like based on whether you touch his trunk or his tusks or his ears or his legs or whatever it is. And so Isaiah's understanding of the Messiah may have been very limited, even to the extent that he even knew that he was prophesying about the Messiah. And by the same token, Daniel's understanding of the timeline of what's happening here may have been significantly limited. In fact, actually, when you look at this particular prophecy, if I remember correctly, and I got to go back here. So, if I remember correctly, what actually happens here, it says, let me see. Yeah. Okay, so if you actually go and read Daniel chapter 11, you have to go back to Daniel chapter 10, in fact. What happens is Daniel has this vision in Daniel chapter 10, it freaks him out. It says he fell into a deep sleep with his face on the ground. That actually is unconsciousness, probably. So in Daniel chapter 10, verse 10, it says, "Behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my knees. And he said to me, Daniel, man, if I esteem," he talks to him some more. But basically, an angel comes to him with a human appearance. And he says, and this is, I'm skipping down to verse 18, he touched him again and strengthened him, and he said, "O man of high esteem, do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Take courage and courageous." Now, as soon as he spoke to me, I received strength and said, "May my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me." Then he said, "Do you understand why I came to you?" But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth, that there is one who stands firmly with me against these forces. There is no one who stands firmly against these forces except Michael, your prince. And it can be confusing because 11 chapter 1 says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And we think that's talking about Daniel, but it's not. It's talking about the angel. The angel is saying, I arose to be a protection. And then he says, and now I will tell you the truth. Everything in Daniel chapter 11 is a quote from an angel, okay? So we have to recognize that this isn't a vision Daniel is having. Now, it may be an explanation of Daniel's vision and what he saw that freaked him out so much, but it's actually an angel explained to him, this is what's going to happen. So in terms of the timelines involved, Daniel may not have had any real sense of what the time distances were at all, and the angel may not have been at all working in terms of I mean, obviously there's a linearity to certain aspects of this, but there's no real expectation that there's going to be a linear, direct result of, okay, this is what happened and this is what happened next. The angel may be jumping ahead to what's really important.
A stenographer doesn't necessarily understand.
That's exactly it. And that's what's really going on here. There's no question about that. So when we understand it in that context, we need to realize that Daniel is not seeing these events take place. He is literally having someone tell him, these are the things to write down about what's going to take place.
And that's really cool, because God doesn't care about time like we do.
Right.
He created it for our benefit.
Exactly. And that seems to be, at least to my view, that is the best explanation for what's going on here that preserves the sanctity of Scriptures. But again, the reason I bring all this out and the reason we spent so much time on this, more than we should have probably, is because I think it's important for us to be aware that this is an issue that, you know, that can come up when you're dealing with people who have been studying and learned some of the issues that are raised by scholars with regard to the book of Daniel. So, okay, we're going to stop because we're way over time. Thank you for your patience.